Welcome to this week of Outside the Circle. As we just finished up our series on David, I thought it would be neat to kind of do a deep dive into Jesus' family tree. As we we just established that he came from the line of David. So today we'll be talking about like the genealogy of Jesus, a subject that can sound very boring on the surface. So hopefully I'll haven't already tuned out. But hopefully I can make it a bit more exciting. Because when you actually kind of dig into some of these names, it gets really interesting and honestly kind of reveals a lot about Jesus and like his mission here on earth. Um, so let's just kind of get into it. So there are two spots where we see the genealogies for Christ in the Bible. The first one is in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, and Luke chapter 3, 23 through 38. And they're both the same, but they're also very different at the same time. So for starters, Matthew only tracks back to Abraham, whereas Luke goes all the way back to Adam. Matthew goes from Abraham to Jesus forward in time, but Luke goes from Jesus to Adam backwards in time, which is a fun nod to kind of the authors and their background. See, Matthew was a Jew, so he tracks from Abraham, the father of Jews, to prove that Jesus really to prove to the Jews that Jesus is their promised Messiah. But Luke, who's a Gentile, tracks all the way to Adam to show that Christ is for all of humanity. Another difference is they already track different sons of David. See, Matthew follows Solomon and Luke follows Nathan. And this discrepancy is most likely, as most scholars kind of say and believe, is due to the tracking of the different lineages. Matthew tends to track Joseph's line, while Luke tracks Mary's line, and that's kind of why there's this discrepancy in like the names and how they look different. And I think that's kind of another cool fact with these genealogies is because they show. Like Matthew tracks Jesus's royal lineage, which is obviously important to the Jews for the promised Messiah. But Luke is following his bloodline, which isn't as important when you realize that like Luke is writing to the Gentiles, so they're not as concerned with, hey, we know the promised Messiah comes through this line. Like they wouldn't have really known that. So I think it's interesting that Luke kind of tracks through the bloodline, being more of the historian, whereas Matthew's like, okay, let me show you Jews where all this, comes about and how Jesus is related to Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation and things like that. And so I think that's kind of neat. And again, just another kind of cool way of their kind of differences. And this will be important when we kind of look back at specific names a little later, So let's just kind of get into it. I mean, what names are really listed in the genealogies, right? So let's just take a look at a few of these. We'll kind of start with Matthew's list first, especially since it's the first gospel. So again, he tracks from Abraham forward in time, so that's how we're just kind of read some of these names as we go through. I'm not going to read every single name just because... For one, they get complicated. For two, if I started reading all these, half you would probably tune out because it's just so-and-so begot so-and-so who begot so-and-so. And honestly, me butchering half those names, none of us would care to listen. So I'm just going to kind of pick some of the big ones and kind of show some cool things with some of these. Obviously, you have really big names like Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation. Isaac, which is Abraham's son, who was the son of promise from God. And for those who kind of know that story of these two, it's a prime example of the coming of the promised Son of God. In the essence of God telling Abraham, like, hey, this is your promised son, but I want you to go sacrifice him to me. And, Abraham goes to do it, and then the angel stops him, and Isaac is spared. And all this is not only kind of testing Abraham's faith, but honestly showing how difficult, because if you look at that story and you're appalled, like, oh my gosh, why would God ask, Abraham to do that? It's like, that's kind of the point, like the point of that story is for us to have that shock factor, because saying, how could someone sacrifice their own son? And it's like that's kind of the point. It's like God obviously sends Jesus as the atoning sacrifice for us. And so again, that's the parallel there. God saying, I want you to be shocked by this story because now you understand where I'm at, of sending my son to die for you guys. Like, this is the weight of that, so to say. And so it's just kind of really cool. Again, pointing towards Christ. Then you get Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Obviously, Jacob's also the father of Joseph. For those who know the story, coat of many colors. His ascension of the Egyptian hierarchy, so to say, through a series of really bad ups and downs. But the same Jacob also fathered Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is actually the promised line of the Messiah. In fact, Jesus is actually referred to as the Lion of Judah. So, it's kind of cool to see that, and his name popping up there. You kind of, for those who've ever wondered, like, why is he called the Lion of Judah? It's like, well, this is why. He comes from the line of Judah, which is kind of a neat story there if you ever go dig back into that in the book of Genesis. The next one we see that's kind of a more predominant one, not the next name in line, but the next kind of predominant name, is Boaz. He's known as the kinsman redeemer, is kind of what his story is. We actually see his book or his story in the book of Ruth. We'll kind of get into that in a little bit later for something, so kind of a foreshadowing of things to come. But it's another great example of Christ in like the Old Testament. This time as kind of our redeemer. With Isaac, we see like, the promised son, whereas with Boaz, we see this idea of a redeemer, a kinsman redeemer, and that Christ would be our redeemer. We'll get more into that in a second. And of course, the next big name on the list is the biggest name, and the reason we're kind of doing this, King David. Again, we just got done talking about him, so our last session was all about him, so I don't think I need to go too far down that road. If not, you can just go back and re-listen, and you'll kind of see almost all of his story. But I think the big thing to kind of take away from this one is that, like, he is who God establishes an eternal kingdom through, that the Messiah would also, would come through this line of David, the Davidic covenant that we talked about a couple times over the last few weeks, that Christ would come through David's line, and that he would reign over Israel as the eternal king, and that this would come from David's line. And that's about to get really interesting when we get into another name in a minute. Obviously, David's son that he had with Bathsheba was Solomon. As we talked about during David's legacy, Solomon's kind of call to fame, other than being the wisest man and writing a few books of the Bible, was that he built God's temple in Jerusalem. Again, David really wanted to do it. God said, you know what? Thanks, but no thanks. I'm going to let your son do it. And so Solomon was able to build the temple in Jerusalem that would end up being destroyed during the Babylonian exile, and then rebuilt later, which we're actually about to get into, because the next name on this list, this is down the road a little bit, but the next name that I want to discuss is actually a man named Jeconiah. And it's a name that most people probably don't recognize, kind of skip over, but it's actually a really interesting name. Jeconiah is actually the last king before the Babylonian exile of Israel. And this one's just a real fun one to me. It's not a name that many talk about, but it's probably one of the more fascinating names simply due to his story. Obviously you got the big guys like David and Abraham and some of them, but just in essence of the story itself, it's a really fascinating one. See, Jeconiah kind of continued his family tradition of the last couple of kings right before exile that just kind of fell away from God and weren't paying attention to him and just doing their own thing and living in their own wicked ways. And so in Jeremiah chapter 22, we see that God actually puts a curse on Jeconiah and his offspring and said that none from your line shall rule over Judah again. It's pretty big. Because again, Jesus comes from this line. So here we are saying, like, if you're a Jew back in the day, you're like, okay, so God places this curse on Jeconiah and says, hey, look, no one from your line will sit on the throne again. And yet Jesus comes through this. So if you're a Jew, your brain automatically says, well, you know what? See, Jesus can't be our promised Messiah because he is not from, he can't be from the line of Jeconiah, so to say, because Jeconiah has this curse. It would, in theory, have to, I guess, be, in their mind, it'd have to be from another line that doesn't go through Jeconiah, which we'll get to in a little bit. But what's really interesting here is when you look into it. So, like I said, Matthew tracks his royal lineage, which goes through Solomon and so forth and down the list, right? Well, so all that from Solomon comes all the way down through Jeconiah with his curse and goes down to Joseph, Jesus's earthly father, so to say. And so what's really cool here, though, is when you understand a very crucial detail, and that is that Joseph wasn't Jesus's biological father, right? So for those who know, Jesus comes through the virgin birth of Mary, so Joseph isn't his actual father. Like, it's not his biological father. It is just his earthly father, okay? And so what this does, though, this is what's really cool. So with Jeconiah's curse, it's a curse on his offspring, right? So it's a blood curse in essence, right? Because it's going through his bloodline. But see, since Jesus doesn't come from his bloodline, because he's not actually Joseph's blood son, right? This curse doesn't apply to Jesus. So through Joseph, Jesus gets the legal right to David's throne. But since he's not blood with Joseph, the curse does not apply to him. And that's just really cool if you ask me. Like, I don't know, that's a really fun fact I learned probably about a year ago now. And I just think that's, like, it's such a, like, cool and just, like, I don't know any other way to say it. Like, it's just so cool. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it's so neat to just see this, like, name that you kind of skip over in a genealogy, but it's actually a really important name to kind of show that, like, see, Jesus can't be Joseph's biological son because he would have that same curse put on him. So for him to be the promised Messiah, he cannot have that blood curse. And how do you get around that? Well, it's because he's not his actual blood son. So he inherits the earthly side of it of, like, hey, that's my earthly father. So through him, I get this royal lineage to say that I am a part of the line of David, as far as the royal line of David, to succeed and be this eternal king of Israel that, Christ becomes. I say becomes, that Christ is. Whereas, but because he's not through that blood, he doesn't have the curse that was put on Jeconiah. And so it's almost like, in a weird way, I say it's a weird way, but it's like God kind of already has that, like, hundreds of years before Jesus is born. This curse is put on Jeconiah, knowing good and well what would come about that. And it's like, it's almost like God's putting proof, like, hey, I'm going to put this here, and this is going to be proof that Joseph isn't his biological daddy, so that, he can have the rewards of the royal lineage, but not the curse of the bloodline. And it's so cool to see how that works out. And there's a few other times we'll see neat little things like that in Scripture with the genealogy. The next one, again, not necessarily next in line, but the next kind of big name is Zerubbabel. He rebuilds the temple after Israel's exile. So when Israel comes back from their exile, he helps rebuild the temple that was destroyed. So he helps rebuild Solomon's temple. And that's actually really cool. When you go into Jesus' final weeks, or the final week with Holy Week, where Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days, referring to himself. But the Jews would register as, like, their temple, and so that's like a no-go, because they're like, hey, this temple took years to make, and you're trying to say that, you can raise it up in 3 days, like, you're crazy. And so it's kind of fun. But anyways, Zerubbabel is cool because he embodies the restoration from God even when all seems lost. And that's kind of a cool little thing from his story. And then you skip a few more generations and you get to Joseph, who, again, is the legal father of Christ as far as the earthly father, which is where he gets his Davidic royal line from, like we just talked about, which makes Jesus the Messiah. But again, he's obviously not his earthly father. So through Matthew's genealogy, we see some big names and some big moments that all point to Jesus as this promised Messiah, an eternal king of Israel, and the fulfillments of God's covenants. And so that's kind of some cool things you kind of see in there and kind of get from it. Um, and since Matthew was a Jew, like I said, he was trying to convince the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah that they have waited for. And this was just massive in the evidence for that, of just all these names, all these, like, people would have recognized it. Even in earlier Torah, you would have been able to see some early, I mean, the book of Genesis has 11 genealogies within it. And so, but throughout the course of time, like, genealogies were such a big deal, especially when you understand, like, oh, hey, the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants, like, all this is coming together, the Messiah. So it's like, it's very crucial in keeping these records to say, where is the Messiah, so to say. So Matthew's like, boom, here it is. I'm proving to you with your own history books that Jesus Christ is the Messiah we have waited for. And so that's kind of a really cool thing. But something else Matthew also includes is really interesting, especially for a Jewish genealogy, because he includes 5 women. And that's not typical for a Jew, because they are a very patriarchal, like, male-centered oriented society. And so they didn't really care about the women, especially within the genealogy. So it's really interesting that he includes 5, but what's really cool is when you dig into the 5, because, like, what's so special about these 5 women, So let's take a quick look. So the first one listed in there that we see is Tamar. Her story is found in Genesis 38. Her husband died in Judah. Yes, that Judah from earlier that we were discussing, that Jesus, the Lion of Judah. That Judah failed to fulfill his family obligation to provide another son to Mary. So Judah ended up marrying her, and she had twins with him. And so her story proves that God can work through human failure, even when even in a broken family situation, since Jesus comes from this line. The next is Rahab. Her story is in Joshua 2 and 6. She helps the Israelite spies when they entered Jericho, because she believed that Israel's God was the one true God. And so she helps these spies. Again, you can see the story in Joshua when Israel, after they come out from the Exodus and they're going to the Promised Land. You have Jericho sitting there, Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, right? For those who know. And so she helps with that. But the scandalous part of her story is that she was a prostitute. Yes, in the line of Jesus is a prostitute. Former prostitute, that is. See, her story shows that God can redeem anyone, and that God's family is for all who choose him, regardless of their past. The next one is Ruth. Her story is in the book of Ruth. As mentioned with Boaz earlier, that's why I said we'll kind of come back to this. Ruth's story is about loyalty and redemption, because she stayed loyal, and Boaz ends up becoming her kinsman redeemer. Again, that's a really cool story. It's a really short, Ruth, I think it's only like 4 or 5 chapters. It's a really short book, so recommend you reading it. Not going to get too much into it, other than the fact that her story really shows that God's plan for salvation is for all nations. And again, Boaz kind of showing that redeemer side that Christ would be. The next one is a name that you should all be familiar with, and it's Bathsheba. Some versions actually have her, when it says David, or it says Solomon fathered by David and Uriah's wife, basically is what it says. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but basically it refers to her as Uriah's wife, not Bathsheba. It just says like David through Uriah's wife or whatever, had Solomon, which is pretty crazy that it specifically states Uriah's wife. But she became a part of one of the greatest moral failures and really the biggest scandals of royal Israel, so to say. One of the first royal family scandals, I guess you could say, of Israel. And yet here she is in the line of Christ. Like, that's crazy. Like, her story shows that God can redeem and move even in human sin to accomplish good things by his mercy. The last name on this list is Mary, seen in the Gospels, primarily in Luke 1 and 2. She's the mother of Jesus. I think we all kind of know her significance. I mean, that's basically the big significance, is she is the mother of Jesus, that God chose her to be the mother of Christ. But here's kind of the cool thing when you dig into these names. So 5 of the women listed here, 4 of them are Gentiles. See, Tamar was a Canaanite, Rahab was from Jericho, Ruth was a Moabite, Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, was a Hittite, presumably. And of course, Mary was a Jew. And like all four of these Gentiles were involved of moments of redemption in some form or fashion. And so it's just kind of cool because to me it shows that God redeems all people of all nations regardless of their past. Like their past. It only matters that you choose God. Again, kind of like with Rahab, like, as long as you choose God and put him first, like it doesn't really matter where you've been or what you've done. Like he redeems all from all nations. So speaking of Gentiles, the genealogy found in Luke would have been written to the Gentiles, like I said earlier. And so now, while some of these names are similar, there are different ones since Luke tracks through David's son Nathan, not through Solomon. And so what's cool here is we do see prophets, like the minor prophets of like Amos and Nahum in there, which is kind of cool. And a few other names that are similar in Matthew's, especially from David back to Abraham, are kind of listed there. So I'm not going to really get into those because we kind of just talked about a good bit of them. But Luke, being the historian he was, actually went all the way back to the beginning. And so what names do we really see here? So again, he works backwards, so I'm going to kind of list them backwards since that's how he did it. So you have Shem, son of Noah, who was on the ark with Noah. You got Noah, the ark builder. Famous story. I think most of us know that one. Methuselah, who was the oldest man to ever live. Kind of fun. Enoch, the man who walked with the Lord and was no more. Basically, he never died. And so, because of that, actually, some believe that he will be one of the two witnesses that we see in the book of Revelation that will come back at the end. There's never any names given to those two, and since Enoch didn't die, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, Enoch's going to be one of them that shows up then. So that's just a fun little side note. Then you get to Seth, which is the son of Adam and Eve. Obviously, you got Cain and Abel and their whole story, and then here's Seth. And then you have Adam, the first man of creation. So that's a pretty cool big name right there, right? So again, going all the way back to Adam is actually a really big deal for what Luke is trying to accomplish here. Like I said, Matthew was speaking to Jews, so he stopped at Abraham to show how Christ is the promised Messiah of their people that God set up through David, through Abraham, with the covenants he made with them. But again, Luke was speaking to the Gentiles. So he goes all the way back to Adam to show that Christ came for all of mankind. See, Christ is like this new Adam of sorts, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, right? He kind of calls him this new Adam because like Adam sinned and brought destruction to the world, but Jesus was perfect, and through his death and resurrection, he brought new life to this dead world. And so, you have this idea of this new Adam, the final Adam of sorts, so to say, again, that Paul kind of talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. Where Christ is here to redeem the world and create new life, so to say. Now, here's one of the coolest parts of Luke's genealogies, if you ask me. And it's when you look at the names from Adam to Noah, and you look at their meaning, like the meanings of their names. So, like, Adam means man, Seth means appointed, Enosh means mortal, Kenan means sorrow, Mahalalel, yep, I knew I was going to butcher it. Anyways, means the blessed God. Jared means shall come down. Enoch means teaching. Methuselah means his death shall bring. Lamech means despairing. Noah means rest. So that's just through those lines. But when you put them all together, it literally reads, man is appointed to mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest. Like, is that not cool? I mean, that's literally the gospel in the line of Christ. Like, the first few members in the line of Christ, all the way from Adam, literally is telling the plan of the gospel, really of the entire scripture, which, so, like, the entire Bible is basically listed there, right? Like, you can't tell me God didn't have a plan from the word go when literally this is in the name of people. Like, it's crazy. Like, I don't know, that's so cool to me. that within the first few lines in human history, from Adam, you have this line of people that literally are in the line of Christ. So obviously there's other brothers and sisters involved here, but from the ones that are directly in the line of Christ, it literally lays out the plan of what Christ would do, and his mission for the world. So I think that's really cool. So what does all this really mean at the end of the day? I mean, there are some really cool facts, there's some really fun stuff, but I think when you put them all together, it really just means that God clearly had a plan since day one. Also, that even boring stuff in Scripture can be fascinating when you look a little deeper. Fun fact of the day, just hint, hint, always be watching and looking and digging deeper, because you never know what kind of cool little nuggets you're going to find. But I do think mostly that God was really methodical in every step along the way of the line that would bring the promised Messiah, right? Like, we see that with the names there. We see it with the people who were involved with it. Even with people like Jeconiah, like, it was very intentional, like, all these people, between their names, between the events that happen in their lives, by things that do, you got like Boaz and Isaac that point straight to Christ. Like, all these people show that there is clearly a method to what is going on in the genealogy of Christ. Like, God didn't just randomly be like, oh yeah, I'll do it here. Like, from day one, there has been a step-by-step of what is what. And, because again, when you dig in, you see that Jesus' genealogy tells us the story of the Bible, from creation to the covenants, to the establishment of a kingdom, or like the kingdom, to exile, to restoration, and finally to Christ himself, And through all of it, it really does also just kind of show God's character. Like, it shows his love, his faithfulness, his grace, his mercy, his redemptive power. Like, all this stuff is just seen. His intentionality, again, like being methodical in the way things are here, that God isn't just a God of chance or random. Like, there is reason behind what he does. Even in the bad, like there's reasons, there's hope, there's a future and stuff. And so I think that's just really cool. And like, all this really at the end of the day is just the good news for all mankind, and like for those who call on the name of the Lord, that God from day one has had a plan to redeem us. And even in our failures, even in our sins, even in our just complete stupidity, like, God still has a way to redeem us, and God still chooses us. All he asks is for us to choose him back. And I think that's just really cool. And again, all this is found in basically a history textbook, in the sense of it's just a genealogy, but yet again, God's story and God's character is just written in the entire history of Jesus' line, which makes sense because Jesus' line, who is God, right? The Trinity. And so hopefully I made it a little bit more interesting for you guys. I hope I didn't bore you too much. I think those are really cool facts, but it might just be me. I know I'm a nerd, so but hopefully you guys enjoyed, and we'll be starting our new series coming up, so hope y'all check that out, and we'll see you next time.